Welcome back to Strange Curiosity. My name is Jane, and today we're going to be reading a ghost story from Rock Island, Wisconsin. And this is from the Reddit user Scary Third Eye. So shout out to them. A little bit of backstory. Rock Island is a state park located at the tip of Door County, Wisconsin on Lake Michigan. It's a difficult place to get to. To get to the island, you have to take a car ferry from Ellis Bay to Washington Island, then drive to Washington Island to Jackson Harbor, then take a pedestrian-only ferry to Rock Island. No vehicles or bikes are allowed on Rock Island. Even though the island is relatively small, it's only about 975 acres, it has a very interesting history. In the early 1600s, it was inhabited by a tribe of Potawatomi Native Americans, as well as a small fishing village of European settlers. These two groups did not trust each other, and they did have bad encounters that almost led to violence. But for the most part, they lived peacefully on the island. By the 1640s, the Potawatomi had migrated to other parts of Wisconsin. Shortly after they left the island, some settlers from the fishing village reported seeing a new group of people. They thought there were more white settlers, but they wore strange clothes and kept to themselves. Later, several animals, it was not mentioned who they were, what kind of animals they were. It might have been like pigs or chickens. They were found slaughtered in the village. They seem to have been used to make markings in blood on some of the buildings in the village. On a different night, a building used for preserving meat burned down. The villagers felt that these things must have been done by the new people on the island, and they went and tried to find them. They searched the whole island, including the whole wooded inland area, but they never found anybody. These strange occurrences seemed to stop soon after the search, and none of these settlers were ever seen again. Okay, that's a little creepy. Let's continue on. In 1836, the Potawatomi Lighthouse was built on the northern part of the island. Forgive me if I am mispronouncing that. After construction was finished, the lighthouse was inspected, and it was reported back that the material of which the lighthouse and dwelling are made are the best quality, and that work is... So the first keeper of the light was appointed on December 19th, 1837, and his name was David E. Corbin. Only 3 years later, in 1840, despite the apparent quality of construction of the lighthouse, David started to complain that the plaster started to fall off of the building and some sort of liquid would ooze from the cracks, leaving the house constantly damp. David was completely alone most of the time in the lighthouse, and some had said when visiting him that he would stare at a certain wall and sometimes spoke vaguely of other visitors. In 1845, after 8 years of relatively solitude at the lighthouse, an inspector visited and determined that while David was fulfilling his duties, he was acting strange. The official report says that the inspector ordered David to take a 25-day leave of absence to find a wife, quote unquote, to live with him at the lighthouse. However, some think that the inspector was startled by David Corbin's mental state caused by years of solitude and thought it would be best if he spent some time away from the island. In 1852, David reportedly fell ill and died that December in the lighthouse. He was buried in a small cemetery near the lighthouse. The next lighthouse keeper also reported a surprisingly quick deterioration of the lighthouse. Some friends that had visited the new keeper say that he would talk of seeing strange things in the house at night, but he wouldn't elaborate on what he was seeing. In 1858, after only 22 years of service, the original lighthouse was torn down and a new one was built. From that point on, the lighthouse keepers were required to have an assistant keeper or a family with them at the lighthouse. No strange occurrences were further reported in the lighthouse logbook outside of strong storms and occasional shipwrecks, except on January 20th, 1876. The lighthouse keeper at this time's name was Betts. He reported that he saw two men attempting to row to the mainland from Washington Island. He wrote a terrible storm came up shortly after their departure, and they never made it to their destination. Over 3 months later, on May 3rd, 1876, Betts wrote, The two men who were lost last January have been seen several times, once from Caney Lighthouse and once from Jackson Port. The men were apparently frozen stiff and sitting upright in the boat among a mass of ice. At last account, they were still adrift. There was not much hope that they will be found and buried. By 1900, most of the island's inhabitants left for better fishing areas on Lake Michigan. In 1910, a successful business owner and inventor, Chester Thordarson, purchased all of the island except for the land that the lighthouse occupied in the north. He used the island as a private summer retreat from his business in Chicago. Chester is responsible for the unique and mystifying building and structures that are still on the island today. On the south end of the island, he built a giant stone hall that has a boathouse on the lower level. A stone water tower was built on the east side of the island, and an imposing wooden gate was constructed at the west end of the island. The Great Hall was used to store Chester's immense book collection. He had over 11,000 books, and it's rumored that he possessed some very rare books in his collection. He died of heart failure on January 6, 1945, though some have speculated that he saw something that actually scared him to death. Okay, so that's all a little bit of background history on Rock Island. Now we're going to get into the Scary Third Eye's actual firsthand experience. So in August of 2021, they took their first, last, and only trip to Rock Island. After taking 2 ferries, I arrived on the island at about 2 p.m. I had booked the remote campsite E, which is a backpacking site that is a little over a mile from the dock. I took my time hiking out to the site to enjoy the scenery, taking a couple breaks because my pack was heavy. I was definitely packed for more camping than hiking. I got to my site, set up the tent, and got everything situated, and started gathering sticks and driftwood from the beach so I could start a fire. On my third trip back from the beach, back to my site, I heard a single high-pitched squeal noise coming from the forest. It didn't sound close, but it was such an unusual sound that it stopped me in my tracks, and I waited a good 30 seconds to see if it would happen again. It didn't, so I continued back to my site. When I got back, I began working on getting a fire started. The remote camping sites on Rock Island are pretty well spaced out. Sites C, D, and E are grouped together, and there's probably about 100 yards between each. There's not a real trail connecting the 3 sites directly, but enough people have walked the ridge between these 3 sites that there's an obvious path. As I was setting up sticks for my firing, something caught my eye, and I looked up. Fairly far away, it looked like it might be at Site D, or a little further, was a person running in my direction. My first thought was, well, that's odd, because like I said, it's not even a real trail. Then my mind just went to there must be something wrong and this person needs help. They got a little closer and it looked like maybe it was a woman in loose gray clothes, maybe in a hoodie. It was still far enough away that I couldn't really make out the details. I quickly stood up from my crouching position I was in, and just as I did, I heard a high-pitched squeal noise again. It was behind me, and it was much closer this time. This startled me quite a bit, so I turned around and looked behind me. I scanned the trees for a couple of seconds, but didn't see or hear anything. I turned back around because I knew the person running must be getting close, but now they were gone. Again, I stood there and I scanned the trees but could not see them anywhere. I was so confused. I was kind of frozen for a few seconds. It was all very strange, but I was able to reason it out to my head. Must have been a couple fellow campers at Site C or D. Maybe they were running to the toilet. Okay, so where were we? I tried to forget about it, but it was really bothering me. I did not like whatever the squeal noise was, and it just felt strange. With some effort, I decided to let it go and started my fire. I had a quick meal and a couple of cocktails, then decided to go for a walk. I hadn't seen Site C or D yet, so I thought I would check those out and see if I did have neighbors camping nearby. Site D was empty. I did see the path that led from the site to the main trail and pit toilet, so it made me feel a little less uneasy about the runner. I figured it was maybe someone from Site C that took a strange way from the main trail to get to Site D. It didn't make a ton of sense because I probably still should have seen them, but it did make me feel better. I continued on to Site C and saw there was a tent set up. I really didn't want to bother anyone, and I just thought I would go over with the excuse I wanted to introduce myself because I'm a camping neighbor from Site E, and see if anyone looked like they might be the person running earlier. I came up to the site, and there was a couple sitting at the picnic table. Neither of them looked like they could have been the person I saw running. I introduced myself, and they introduced themselves. They were probably in their mid-30s. They were very nice. Both seemed pretty drunk, but a quiet drunk. I didn't ask about the runner or squealing noises because I thought it might be weird. I wished them a good night and walked back to my tent. When I got back, I had a cigar and a few more drinks. It got dark, and it was started to be the perfect night. The sky was clear, and I was just staring up, looking at a million stars. I felt better about everything from earlier and felt stupid about the whole thing and decided to get some sleep. It was a long day, so I fell asleep immediately. At around 2:30 a.m., I woke up to a huge boom of thunder, and it started downpouring. The wind picked up, and the temperature dropped. I love camping in the rain, but I do not like camping in a lightning storm. A pretty big storm came through, and I was starting to worry. The wind was whipping out my tent, and the ground was shaking from the thunder and lightning. I did not feel good about being out there in a tent and felt very exposed. The storm lasted for about an hour before it came to a light, steady drizzle. I was just starting to fall back asleep when I heard the squeal noise again. I opened my eyes up wide in the dark and lay there silent. There was another louder squeal noise, and it was pretty close. I knew there was no real dangerous animals on Rock Island. There are some deer, porcupines, but there's no bear or wolves. Knowing that didn't make me feel better. There was still something about that squeal I didn't like. I say squeal because that's the best way I can describe it. It sounded to me like a pig squeal. I honestly don't know that much about pig noises, but that's what I thought of when I heard it. An injured or angry pig squeal. I continued to lay in my tent and started to hear footsteps outside my tent. It was still raining, so the sounds were a little buried by the sound of rain, but it definitely sounded like there was some large animal or human walking around. I sat up in my tent and took a knife out. In my head, I just kept saying, it's just an animal, it's fine. There's nothing in these woods that can hurt you. I listened as the footsteps started moving away from my tent. I just sat there, being still, holding my knife for maybe 10 minutes without hearing anything else. I started thinking to myself, it's fine, it's just an animal, you're being stupid, you need to get some sleep. I was just about to lay back down when there was a very loud squeal right outside my tent. It felt like my heart just stopped and sent a shiver down my spine. My heart was beating so hard, my entire body was pulsing, and I felt it in my ears. It took everything in me, but I forced out a "get out of here," not shouting, but as stern and mean sounding as I could. I didn't hear any more squeals or footsteps at night, but I also didn't sleep. I just sat there in my tent for maybe an hour before I lay down. Eventually the rain stopped, and I kept laying there until the sun came up, all the time reassuring myself that I was being stupid. It was just an animal. It was probably 7 a.m. before I decided I had to get out of my tent to relieve myself. As soon as I stepped outside my tent, I saw that my picnic table had been turned over and was upside down. When I saw this, I was surprisingly calm. I thought, okay, this is enough. I'm leaving. I checked my surroundings, and there was nothing else seemed to be out of place. I eventually reasoned with myself that a heavy wind had blown the table over in the storm. It still seemed a little strange because the table was pretty heavy, and I felt like I would have heard the table flipping over. But that might have made sense. I made some instant coffee, had a bite to eat, started feeling better about the whole thing, and then decided to go for a hike. I admit I get easily scared when I'm camping by myself in the woods. Maybe that's natural. Yes, I think that's very natural. After I had some coffee and food, the sun came out, I realized that nothing I heard or saw was really anything that couldn't be explained. Other than not getting a good night's sleep, I was having a pretty good time. The reason I came to the island in the first place was to hike the 7-mile Thordarson's Loop. That's Chester's Loop from the background. And there was a lot of interesting things to see. I packed a few things in my backpack and started off. Fairly close to my site is the water tower. I have no idea how it originally worked or why it was a tower, but it's an impressive building with a fireplace that looked like someone had recently had a fire in it. A little further down the trail was a cemetery where 2 sisters and a few others were buried. It's believed that there are still more buried, but they are in unmarked graves. These are likely some of the settlers from the old fishing village. The island had 3 cemeteries. There is one by the beach, and that's where Chester Thordarson is buried. There's one in the eastern part of the island where the 2 sisters are buried, and there's one at the northern part of the island where the original lighthouse keeper, David E. Corbin, is buried. There is also at least one Potawatomi burial ground on the island, but no one knows exactly where that is. I kept walking down the trail until I saw a nice scenic overlook with a bench where I sat down and drank some water. I started to hear some talking on the trail ahead of me, but I couldn't see anyone yet. There's a bend in the trail, and the trees were thick, so I sat on the bench waiting for the people to come around. The voices were coming closer. I could tell they weren't speaking English, but I couldn't place the language it might have been. Both voices were very, very deep and guttural. Then, back deep in the woods, I hear a loud and quick, "Oh, oh!" Immediately, both voices I was listening to respond with their own, "Oh, oh, oh, oh!" I kind of smiled because it sounded like these 2 heard whatever it was in the woods and were trying to be funny and mocking it. I got off the bench and put my backpack on and started walking in the direction further down the trail from where the voices were from, but I never did find these people. The rest of the hike went very well. I visited the cemetery where David E. Corbin was buried. I took a self-guided tour of the lighthouse. I passed the wooden gate that apparently used to be a part of a larger structure. I walked by the Great Hall and Dark area from when I arrived on the island, visited some other structures, came across the cemetery where Chester Thordarson is buried, then finished the loop by returning to my campsite. It was a very nice hike with a lot to see and wasn't especially difficult, but I was tired. I did walk down to the campsite seat to ask the couple I spoke with the night before how they did during the storm that night, but they had packed up and left. I was disappointed because I really wanted to ask them about the squealing noises during the night. The rest of the evening was pretty uneventful. I was ready for bed, had a fire, some food, cigar, and some drinks, and it got dark quickly. I got in my tent and quickly fell asleep. I might have slept for about 3 hours when I woke up suddenly and was immediately on full alert. Nothing that I was aware of caused me to wake up, but I felt something was wrong. I sat up in my tent, and this part is hard to explain. A feeling of complete dread washed over me. It was unlike anything I've ever felt before. It felt like there was something in the tent with me, and I could feel that it was angry, seething with anger, rage, and its hatred for me. It felt like something very bad was about to happen, and I couldn't do anything about it. I started to shiver uncontrollably. There was a smell of garbage or rotten meat, and it got stronger and stronger to the point where I wanted to throw up, but couldn't because I was frozen. I had never felt so exposed and helpless. I stared forward at nothing, just frozen. And the weird thing is that I accepted whatever was about to happen to me. It was this, like my brain telling me that whatever is about to happen, even if it's death, will at least be relief. Then I passed out. Or at least I thought I passed out. That's all I remember until I woke up at about 8 a.m. that morning. When I woke up, I was laying outside of my sleeping bag on top of it, and my legs were in an unnatural and uncomfortable position. I was on my back, my left leg was straight out, and my right leg was bent so that my foot was up against my left knee. My heart started pounding, but I kept thinking to myself, it was a dream. I'm leaving right now. It was a dream. I'm leaving right now. I packed up everything very quickly and started back toward the dock to catch the first boat off the island. Since the first boat from Washington Island doesn't arrive until about 10:30, I had a little time to kill and went to the Great Hall and dock area. I wanted to get off the island so bad, but I did feel a little better just being out of the... I sat down on a bench a little east of the dock and lit a cigar to give me some time to do something to do while trying not to think about what happened the night before. I was sitting a few minutes and scanning out over the water when I was startled by someone behind me saying, "Hi." I jumped and was embarrassed when the person came around saying, Sorry, I didn't mean to scare you. I saw you smoking and just came over to ask if you had a lighter." I felt like an idiot and told him that it's fine. I just didn't sleep well last night and was kind of zoned out, and I handed him the lighter. He thanked me, lit a cigarette, and handed the lighter back to me. We started talking about the usual things you might talk about. He was from the Madison area. We talked about the storms we've been having. He seemed to be a real outdoorsy kind of guy and talked about his plans to move to Washington Island. It was a very nice, normal conversation and kind of took my mind off of the night for a little bit. He seemed like a pretty nice guy. Then naturally he asked me what site I've been staying at, and I told him I was at site E the last 2 nights. And he said he usually books that site, but I must have reserved it before him. He said he booked site D for 2 nights. I was surprised because there was no tent or anything at site D the 2 times I had walked past. I told him this, and he said he comes to the island a few times a year and you have to book a site, but he usually camps at different areas on the island. I asked him where he camps, and he told me most of the time he camps in the East Cemetery, but he also likes to camp in the woods south of the lighthouse. He told me that he hikes about halfway down the Fernwood Trail and just heads north into the woods where he finds a place to camp. He said that one time he found the ruins of a small log house in the woods, and he was trying to find it again and camp outside of it. At this point, I started to change my opinion about this guy and wanted to change the subject. But then he asked me if I had heard screeching noises in the woods. I took a second to reply and knew he was talking about the squealing I had heard. I told him I had and asked if he knew what it was. This time he took a second to reply, and I saw his face changed. He looked as if he was thinking if he could tell me something, like a secret. With no expression on his face, he looked at me and said, "A demon lives on this island." Under any other circumstance, I would have laughed this off, but not after what I experienced the night before. He looked at me and must have seen the anxiety and fear I was feeling. He surprised me by letting out a quick laugh. He asked me if I saw anything that night. I told him I hadn't seen anything, and he stared at me like he was trying to figure something out. I felt he could tell that I had experienced something. At this point, I was ready for the conversation to be over. Then he told me he had seen something in the cemetery that night. Now, his face and mood changed again, like he was trying to confide in me. I really did not want to ask the question, but I knew he wanted me to ask the question. So I asked him the question what he saw in the cemetery, but my voice was shaky. Then I could tell he had changed his mind about telling me. He actually looked at me with empathy and told me that what he saw was hard to explain, but if I was afraid of the screeching noises, he didn't think I should go near the cemetery. I didn't see anything right away, but there were 4 words without any context. Keepers of the Flame. I looked at my cigar, and the ash was long. I put it out. I told him that I was going to go wait by the dock for the boat. He nodded, and I started to walk away. After a few steps, he said, "Hey," and I turned around to look at him. He just said, "Don't come back here." I turned around and started walking again. I don't know if that was a warning, a friendly suggestion, but I took it to heart. I was definitely not coming back to Rock Island. When I got home, I looked up Keepers of the Flame as it pertained to Rock Island. I found 3 things that he could have been referring to. The name of the Native Americans that lived on the island, the Potawatomi, could be translated to Keepers of the Flame. The lighthouse keepers of the island were sometimes referred to as the Keepers of the Flame. Then there are also a 19th century cult that was said to visit the island from time to time and called themselves the Keepers of the Flame. I know that hundreds of people visit Rock Island every year and have a great time camping, hiking the trails, and exploring Chester Thornton's buildings. My humble suggestion is do not go to Rock Island. What a story from Scary Third Eye on Reddit. What do y'all think about this story? What do you think it could be? Could it be the Potawatomi? Could it be the lighthouse keepers? My money is probably on the cults because that is sketch. Thanks for listening. Until next time.